The archaeologists who have been carrying out the actual on-field research at Petra, Jordan, say that a very small portion of the full site is currently excavated, possibly some 2 to 15%. And those percentages would be very rough estimates by themselves because they don't even know where the site ends. They're just at the beginning, so do they have any clue even how far it could reach? At a couple of spots, it is clearly visible that there are full stories, full floors below what is now ground level. So for what reason there is no active archaeological excavations going on the site? Jordan is not a poor country. This is its most famous tourist attraction. There is definitely no lack of funds. There is also no lack of desire. People are very keenly interested in their most ancient history, and yet nothing is done. Why? They do have a good reason indeed for suspending all archaeological work there. If the real Petra is shown to the world in its actual glory, people will quickly figure out that the textbook history of this site has little to do with reality, and people will place huge question marks next to many other chapters of our so-called history. Let's start with the basics. Erosion marks. Those are extremely interesting at Petra. The cave-like rooms, some call them burial tombs, at the site are in very bad condition. They are broken apart. In many cases we just have one corner of the room left only. It is that bad. But the interesting are the erosion marks on those broken exposed parts. They have suffered such a severe erosion that they have been rounded. Such rounding can occur only after rocks are being exposed to the elements for many thousands of years. And this rate of erosion is not some alternative history version, but is the rate according to mainstream geology. The erosion marks could serve as a classic example of any geology textbook on how rocks erode. All the carvings in Petra are made into the solid bedrock, which happens to be a red sandstone in this area. This variety of bedrock is of medium hardness, which means that it would take at least hundreds of thousands of years to achieve these rounded corners of erosion. That's the minimum. The maximum is millions of years. What is even more interesting is that extreme erosion can be seen on the inside of many of these rooms, premises, caves, whatever you want to call them. One possible explanation of this could be that during these millions of years that they have lived through, they spent some of that time underwater. Now, this is exactly what I mean by extreme erosion and rounded, severely rounded edges. These rooms appear to have been a part of a flat apartment once upon a time, but some force, an earthquake or a weapon, or maybe even gradual erosion, has worn out really parts of the room, some of the rooms. Now the specific point that I want you to point your attention is that the rounding has occurred after parts of these flats have been chopped off, and not before. Or have a look at what has been at once some sort of a door or a gate. I sincerely doubt the original design was anything similar to this, without floor below it and leading from nowhere to nowhere. What would be the purpose? If you have a mother-in-law that you don't like, you just invited to go through this gate, or what? Most likely there were premises at least on one side of the room, and now they have gone missing. Another interesting question is what happened to all of the material that fell apart or somehow, I don't know, evaporated from the rest of this building. This is also nowhere to be found around, but I'll go into this in a while. For now, just concentrate on the fact how much of these flats, of these structures, is actually gone missing, and how much the corners that were once sharp, if it was an earthquake or a natural force that we know of. One doesn't even need to be a geologist, even a simple thinking will do. Imagine, notice how many of the rocks that you see around in nature are sharp pointed and how many of them are rounded. Well, a lot of the cliffs that you see around have stones with very sharp angles. If stones become rounded by being exposed to the elements just for some 1,000 or 2,000 years, everything around that you see in terms of stone, almost everything should have been rounded by now. But it is not rounded. Most of it, it's sharp. Such rounding takes time. Maybe it's not exactly the time period as geologists are telling us, because that's another branch of science that has been corrupted by the penguins, but it does take a long time, definitely many thousands of years. Now these are the sides of the narrow passage in which the famous treasury at Petra has been carved. On both sides of this passage, numerous remains of parts of heavily eroded rooms can be seen. Looking at their position, it becomes quickly clear that the passage looked quite different at the time when these rooms, or whatever you want to call them, were in use. Most likely the passage didn't even exist at that time. There are thousands of partially visible rooms that definitely prove that parts of the mountain, not just a bit on the surface, but really large parts of the full mountains, were still intact when these premises were made and designed. In thousands of cases, remains of rooms are visible on high vertical cliffs. It is obvious that the full mountain looked radically different when these rooms were in use. Look at these rooms here. They are located on an almost vertical slope, and this vertical slope is very well eroded, rounded by the elements for so many thousands of years. To suggest that some earthquake 2,000 years ago destroyed these structures is absolutely ridiculous, even without knowledge of geology. Here again, one more of the countless examples of remains, traces of rooms situated on vertical cliffs. And this goes on for miles and miles. If a powerful earthquake devastated the region some 2,000 years ago, and even less than that, as so-called historians are badly trying to assure us, then the full region, a large region around here, should have been trashed completely by this extremely powerful earthquake. Just imagine, not just to chop off one rock, but to shake miles and miles of sandstone mountains and turn them into rubble. This is extremely powerful earthquake, if it was indeed an earthquake. And I'm sure that earthquakes have indeed played a major role of the destruction of this complex of apartments, and possibly have done all of the work of the destruction as well, but not 1,600 years ago. That's impossible. The erosion shows a completely different story. And not only the erosion, the full look of the region would be completely different if such an earthquake really occurred in such recent time frame. Look at this full mountain behind the freshly carved, or at least fresher looking carved structure in the front. All those dots in the mountain are those remains of rooms. If indeed a very powerful earthquake 1600 years ago was the cause of the demolition of the rooms on the mountain behind, then everything in the front, including this wonderfully carved structure, would have been under a pile of boulders and would have been reduced to rubble itself as well. But that is not at all the case, and ruins of this style are the proof, or one of the many proofs. This was also built supposedly before this huge earthquake 1600 years ago. If the earthquake trashed the mountain after this was built, it should have been covered under many meters of boulders, but it is not covered. While the network of apartments shows a completely different erosion and also continues underground, it does not appear to have any connection with the current ground level. Do you notice the remains of some sort of larger hall rooms up there on the cliffs? It seems those have been rather large chambers, maybe the size of a concert hall or something like that. So imagine how much the mountain peak was bigger at the time they were designed. So in other words, the official version that this full site of Petra developed was built and destroyed within 300 years is absolutely ridiculous. The previous version, the older version of this history, was that the caves were something, whatever, 1,000 years older than the freshly carved looking stuff. But that's equally ridiculous. The caves were obviously designed and made in a completely different era of extreme antiquity. They might have been used at the later stages, and probably they were. Actually, in some cases they are used till nowadays as shelters, simple dwellings, shops, or cafes for the tourists. Probably you wonder how these erosion signs have escaped the attention of the numerous geologists that must have visited the site. This is how it all works. To start with, one is preloaded with a general timeline about this site, which is accepted to be an absolute truth that cannot be questioned, and one cannot even become an official geologist or historian unless one works and sees everything from the perspective, the point of view that this timeline is an absolute truth, indisputable one. When a certain researcher starts suggesting something more realistic and something more truthful than this preloaded timeline, he is either labeled as no longer scientist, or his work is simply not published, ignored, or ridiculed. So in the case of Petra, this preloaded information happens to be that the full thing was built within the narrow frame of 100 years by a tribe that they have labeled as Nabateans, a tribe of very simple nomadic tent dwellers. This timeline is a result of somebody's fantasy, later on wild, based on extremely dodgy, supposedly ancient sources. Those sources that are portrayed in the mass media as authentic Roman books are nothing less but medieval writings, in the best case based on some old books, and in the less favorable scenario simply composed in the Middle Ages. I have already reviewed in previous videos how various researchers, librarians, and people so on have figured out independently at different historic times that many of the so-called ancient authors are not ancient at all. Although the evidence for that is quite large and overwhelming, it is absolutely overlooked by those who shape the public opinion and create the impression of what scientific history should look like. And so the historic fiction of primitive nomadic tent dwellers building these amazing architectural masterpieces has been labeled and sold as scientific history by the mass media and the parties that compile school textbooks, not by real scientists. Maybe you felt that I'm exaggerating a little bit at this point, but actually I don't. I'm really keen to show you what kind of terrific jokes are published under the disguise of scientific work. Although many mainstream scientists have studied this system of rooms, caves, whatever you want to call them, and have established that they were for dwelling, they are rooms for all kinds of activities, they are water storage reservoirs, and so on, still, in other so-called scientific works, they are still mentioned as indisputably being tombs, burial chambers. Well, there are no bodies or burials found in those chambers. The penguins continue to assure us with great authority, simply because the treasure hunters went in Petra to search for treasure and they couldn't find it, and in desperation they got the bodies with them. They stole the bodies, in other words. What a terrific, genius idea. A thief is going to search for a treasure in the desert to feed his starving family, and he cannot find anything. So what to do? Let's get a stinky body, a stinky mummified bones in my bag, and when I reach home, instead of feeding my family, I'll take out the dead body out of my bag and scare my wife and kids to death with it. But the penguins are not that stupid as you may think. They have other indisputable proofs that these were burial chambers. Here it is. Do you see the shelves on the wall? According to famous scientists with fat titles, the shelves are irrefutable proof that this premise could have been used for burial only because on the shelves you put the ashes of the deceased people. Well, the person who came up with this smart idea about the shelves and the ashes must be having a pretty sad life. Every time he enters his kitchen, he will have a ghastly visions of the ghosts of the people whose cremated ashes must be in all the jars that are on the shelves in the kitchen. Because shelves, according to his logic, can only serve to house the cremated ashes of deceased people. Next, to make their Nabatean fantasies look more real, how about enlisting other sites in the same category? So this is another Nabatean site according to the penguins, and the proof of that, according to them, is the look of the stones. My goodness, that means that the Nabateans built that old collapsed barren in my grandmother's village, because the stones look absolutely the same. Next joke, simple nomadic tent dwellers without any knowledge or tradition in stone working or sophisticated tools can produce marks on the stone that very much resemble machine work. Most of the walls in Petra indeed are covered with traces of chisel work, definitely manual work with stone, and yet at numbered places it simply transforms into something else. This photograph is from Petra and is the perfect illustration how two completely different styles of stoneworking are seen along each other. Again, another photograph from Petra. This stonework is found at the height of 20 meters. Well, looking at images like this, it seems after all that the nomadic tent dwellers were only part of the full picture and not everything that there is to it. The main structures at Petra clearly belong to a style that has nothing to do with the tradition of the nomadic tent dwellers. The penguins wisely add to their theory that actually the nomads heard about this style from the travelers that were coming from all over Europe and Asia and decided to adopt it. Really, how childishly naive one must be to believe that these wonders of Petra were done by people who just heard about this style and reproduced it. I think it is obvious even to a layman that this was done by a people who belonged to the tradition, that carried and perfected this style through centuries or maybe even longer periods. Beginners don't start at such monumental scale, they start with small imperfect pieces. Nothing like that is observed at Petra at all. We immediately see a style that has been already perfected at other places over long periods of time. And not only the style, they also use tools that the nomadic tent dwellers don't just start manufacturing in one or two generations after hearing about it from some travelers. It doesn't work like that. Yet another possibility is that there are many other masterpieces at Petra belonging to that very same style, but they are not open to the public, they are not excavated, because showing them to the world will make people doubt that this style has anything to do with Rome in nowadays Italy. And that will lead to unveiling a bunch of other lies, of which consists the official history of the so-called Roman Empire. I have scratched the surface of those misunderstandings very lightly only in a very lengthy video about the so-called Roman Empire. While other parts seem well preserved, the statues are disfigured. Well, how convenient! Then we cannot find out things about the actual builders of the site. And as usual, we see bullet marks on them. So what, the nomadic tent dwellers did the shooting as well? Or did the so-called colonial forces do it again during their cleanup of the memory of the survivors of Atlantis and Hyperborea? As usual, this is a very widely used technique by them. They lined up their soldiers to shoot at the face of the Sphinx in Egypt, and those people who were shooting are now depicted on the pages of the history textbooks as people who went to preserve and study the culture. And by the way, speaking of its sheer size, people who have been there always say that it is very difficult to comprehend it just by photographs. Just for a comparison, it is twice bigger than the famous monument in the United States, seen on the right-hand side. This is what looks like a normal human threshold on the photographs. See how it compares to the size of a lady. The full thing is just totally and absolutely gigantic. Local tour guides sometimes mention that actually two giant skeletons were excavated in year 2007 of a man and a woman. The man was 5.5 meters high and the lady 3.8 meters high. Of course, official information about those findings simply does not exist. But I must note that the sheer scale of the building perfectly befits human beings of that height, most definitely. I watched a very interesting scientific documentary about Petra. Amongst other funny stuff, they tried to make a much smaller, modern replica of one of the what they call Nabatean tombs. They found a huge boulder of red sandstone in California and started the project. They attempted to use the same tools which supposedly the Nabateans had at their disposal, but they reached nowhere. In the very beginning, it became clear that it is impossible to achieve any result using those tools, and they quickly shifted to modern equipment. They also explained very well that this is not cheating, they are still making an authentic copy of the tomb, the way the Nabateans made it, but the small detail that they are using completely different tools shouldn't make any difference at all, because after all, the Nabateans had unlimited time and manpower to do it, while the projects nowadays are limited. Which I find extremely weird, because in this very same documentary they repeatedly convinced us that everything on the site was built within 100 years. Yes, they repeated it many times, and the population of the city at its peak, not during construction, was maximum some 30,000 inhabitants. So what is this unlimited time and manpower over there in the desert where there was nothing before they were building, supposedly? And even if we assume, for the sake of the argument, that somehow they could gather a few thousand men in the desert out there and feed them for 100 years to build something, still the volume of stone that they could cut out of the solid bedrock won't count even, I don't know, even 1% of what Petra is. If we count all the rooms, caves, tombs, or whatever you call them, still the volume will remain the same, thousands of cubic meters of hard rock. We can't even begin to calculate how many thousands of years would a couple of thousand men need to chisel this out manually from the solid bedrock, because we don't even know the size of the site. Do you remember? The archaeologists who worked there said some 2 to 15% is visible only. And even that 2 to 15% as such is miles long mountain that is almost hollow, that many rooms, and in some cases huge holes have been carved into the solid bedrock. Even the volume of rock that has been carved out to form the gigantic amphitheater cannot compare to the volume of stone that has been taken out of the so-called tombs. The amphitheater by itself, it's such a huge project that we can't even imagine. When I have it all in one photograph, the people are so small, they are not visible. To suggest that a primitive tribe could organize the logistics of housing, organizing, feeding, and so on, a group of men in the desert to build all this by chiseling out it manually from the bedrock is ridiculous. The guys in California who started an infinitesimally smaller project compared to the amphitheater, they did something of the height of 2 or 3 meters. In an hour or so, they saw we're getting nowhere with simple tools. And yet in the very same documentary we are being told, but don't you worry, it wasn't a problem to make millions of times bigger things in the desert. This is a project of a magnitude that even engineers have difficulty comprehending. But points like this were of course conveniently missed out and not included in that fantastic History Channel documentary. There was no mention also where did all the waste go. If all this was carved indeed some 2000 years ago, as the penguins are trying to assure us, there should be a very large mountain of rubble beside it. There is no such a mountain anywhere around to be seen. This lack of byproducts is essential. It clearly reveals how preposterous is the mainstream so-called history of Petra. Now let's review the hypothetical scenario that they were not disposing of the rubble in any way, but were just letting it fall on the ground, and the ground level was simply rising. If that was the case, they should have been burying their most beautiful monuments, nowadays called the treasury and the monastery, along with their residential buildings on a regular basis. Those must have ended quite below ground level just because of the sheer enormous volume that has been taken out of the mountains to make them almost hollow. Well, most likely the older parts, those heavily eroded rooms, have seen at least one event similar to what we call the Great Flood, or most likely many of them, and the waves of those floods would have spread the rubble all around, maybe even the world. And more weird stuff from that documentary. Throughout the full film, they were again and again assuring us that all these stone structures are tombs. They were assuring us that the population was living in the city center in very simple, non-durable dwellings, but were working hard on their tombs in the rocks. And there was just briefly mentioned that okay, there were studies, and actually some of these stone rooms happened to be multi-storied dwelling apartments. So what people were carving apartments in the solid bedrock in the cemetery amongst the burials of other people? Is this the History Channel or Comedy Central? Further, they were assuring us how those simple nomadic tent dwellers were making extremely hard waterproof cement and built a fantastic system for water supply and irrigation that requires advanced studies in hydraulics engineering. It's interesting, was everything really carved into the solid bedrock, or there was some plastering used as well? The color of the bedrock seems to be different, even at places where it is cut different than the color of the structure. Another example, the statue seems to be of a different color than the bedrock behind it. Was the statue cast out of geopolymer and glued onto the rock? Is this crust a natural erosion or a plastering? Now this definitely looks like plastering, but the question is, when was it done? during the initial construction or during restoration. It seems that the upper part of the monument was in remarkably good condition even before restoration, so that plastering could be the original one as well, or maybe some old restoration, not a modern one. It is not at all hard to notice that the full site of Petra suffers some sort of erosion or destruction, which is only observed at a level that follows the current ground level. I really wonder what could be the reason for this. Probably many would blame it to the very rare flash floods that happen in the area. But I would sincerely doubt that they would be able to cause this scale of erosion because they are flash floods. They come and go very quickly, and also they are extremely rare. It's desert there. And most importantly, why they started causing this damage only now and not when the ground level was different. Do you see the mesh on the ground? That hole actually reveals a full floor that is below ground now. The story, the floor that is visible below, is also relatively well preserved. Well, at this point, I start seriously questioning, did the full area look anything like nowadays when initially this monument was constructed? Actually, maybe it wasn't even a desert at that time. Why not? In my other videos, I have shown again and again how civilizations were flourishing, the climate was tropical, and then all of a sudden it becomes a desert. And it usually happens very, very quickly. God knows what was the real story and why the inhabitants who built the beautiful monuments or make style left them, what happened to them. I really don't know. The official story sold to us by the historians is extremely fishy. They're always talking about a violent earthquake, but look at this column. Something terrible must have happened to it before it fell from the earthquake. Or do columns fall down only because of earthquakes? They can fall down because of many other reasons as well. Now this scene really looks like an earthquake. Yes, possibly 1600 years ago, because the stones are still sharp, the edges where they cracked. But this could have happened for other reasons too, and most importantly, all the others seem extremely well preserved. Well, basically, we know almost nothing about the actual history of the site of Petra and its destruction as well. And finally, I would like to try to present whatever little we may conclude about the actual history of Petra. The cave-like apartments were made either many thousands of years ago or even millions of years ago. When they were originally made, they were either completely underground cities or at least cities that were going inside solid bedrocks. These cities are a part of a vast network that spreads over a couple of continents, but they're found in greatest concentration in the region of what is now known as Asia Minor, also known as Anatolian Peninsula. The best known example are the Derinkuyu underground cities and the so-called stone towers of Goreme and Cappadocia, all that is in Turkey. They are found in less concentrated form in many other countries, for example, the island of Crete, Matala Beach, all the way to Bulgaria, then Azerbaijan, and even Russia. All of them, including those in Petra, Jordan, are of absolutely same age, proved by the erosion, also made using the same design, and were decorated in a similar style.
Shout, Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, 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 shout, Elijah Rock, coming up. Elijah Rock, shout, Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord.
Satan's a liar and a conjure too.
If you don't mind out, he'll conjure you.
If I could, I surely would.
Just stand on the rock where Moses stood.
Rocking the Elijah Rock.
Shout about Elijah, Elijah, Elijah Rock. We gonna shout about Elijah Rock coming up. Elijah Rock coming up. Elijah Rock coming up. Elijah Rock, shout, Elijah Rock coming up, Lord. 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 Elijah Rock, shout, Elijah Rock coming.
I'm not aware of any sensible research on who were the original builders and residents of the underground cities in Petra, but there have been some attempts along those lines in Anatolia, and they could be relevant to Jordan as well. They were built by humans, more or less our size, and were used for prolonged periods of time. The Anatolian researchers noticed three identifiable periods in which humans of different sizes, some of them were dwarfs, were adjusting the cities to serve better their size and lifestyle. Some of them lived underground along with their cattle. After those extremely ancient civilizations were wiped out, their dwellings remained empty or flooded. Gradually, as the erosion ate up the layers of the earth, it made openings in their what used to be underground cities, and those openings transformed them into caves. Primitive people of our race took shelter in them because they were ready-made. In other cases, they made them places of worship, understanding that they have been made by beings with higher capabilities. The better preserved structure appeared in much more recent time, sometime within the last few thousand years. This particular one is probably done by the survivors of Atlantis and Hyperborea, as it is watermarked by their magnificent architectural style. But the crowd in general must have been quite international, so to say, because we see a variety of architectural styles. These carved gates seem to be in styles similar to that of Mesopotamia and America as well. Over there, this very particular step design is also very widely used. Then pyramids that look like Egyptian obelisks. And Indian looking elephants. Structures of this period appear to have a loose connection with our ground level. Even if we need to dig some even 20-30 meters more to reach the bottom, to reach the ground level as it was when they were making them, still it has some connection with ours. Unlike the underground cities that were later barren by the erosion, they seem to have no connection whatsoever with the current ground level. And the final layer of building is not carved into the solid bedrock anymore. It is composed of stone blocks. Probably that was done at a much later stage than the famous treasury, for example, in Petra. I'm saying probably because the structures that are in this style, made out of stone blocks, they are definitely connected to the current ground level, just a couple of meters below it. Now and then archaeologists even get permissions to dig at such locations. That is more or less allowed because what they will find is expected to correspond more or less to the penguin history that is being presented by the mass media as something absolutely indisputable. Here is an interesting ostrich on the mosaics of that period. Probably the official description will be a turkey. Petra is, of course, UNESCO protected archaeological site. Protected, protection, what kind of protection? Well, that has got two sides to it. First of all, it is protecting the image of the so-called official history in the eyes of the society. It imposes very strict bans on any further excavations because if such digging is done, it will become obvious that the so-called official history is nonsense. But on the positive side, preventing the excavation of such amazing historic sites as Petra means that whatever we find will not fall in the hands of uncivilized barbaric society like ours. When precious artifacts are dug out of the ground, they simply disappear in numbered boxes and nobody knows what happens to them. On a collective level, we haven't matured yet enough to be safeguardians of these precious artifacts, so in one sense it is better for them to stay in the ground, hidden from us, because once they surface they will be either destroyed or never seen again. One day, when we grow up enough to start showing interest towards our real history, then we will deserve those artifacts, and automatically the social structure will appear which will allow excavations and preservations of the precious artifacts and monuments.